Hello, everyone. It's so great to see you all again, and I'm back with another DVD review. And this is one that I've been looking forward to reviewing. I have seen plenty of Little Einstein's episodes, but none of which are as great as the one that is from the fan as but none of them are as loved as the one from the none other than season 2. And because this episode is on this release, I think it's about time we knock off this one before we move on to the others. So, in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the very mixed bag release featuring season 2 episodes, Flight of the Instrument Fairies. So, without further delay, let's get started with the release history. Flight of the Instrument Fairies was first released on DVD on August 5th, 2008 by Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment. Here's a little fun fact about this release. Starting with this release, the following releases, with the exception of Go to America, Go to Africa, and Go to Europe, would contain 4 episodes on each release, which would remain that way for the remainder of Little Einstein's run on DVD until 2013's The Incredible Shrinking Adventure, which would be the last release featuring Little Einsteins. I think this was a very good thing, considering that this meant that we get an extra episode featuring content from the series. Also to mention, before this DVD was released, there was a prototype logo, which is very different compared to the one that we actually got. With the main differences being different music notes, a completely different logo for the DVD itself. The font for the words is different, and it's themed to a piano. And comparing the prototype one to the one that we actually have, I actually like the one we currently have better. It just looks more natural compared to the prototype version. However, after its release on August 5th in 2008, the DVD disappeared. The reason being is that following the release of Race for Space, on the DVDs starting with Flight of the Instrument Fairies would no longer be released after its regular release date. It's not that big of a deal, but it's just something that I have to point out. But other than that, that wraps up the short history of the release. So, now let's go on to the 4 episodes that are on this release. So, on this release, Flight of the Instrument Fairies contains 4 episodes which are all from Season 2. And the stories for the release are Flight of the Instrument Fairies, The Puppet Princess, The Glass Slipper Ball, and Little Red Rocket Hood. So, let's begin with our first episode, Flight of the Instrument Fairies. When the Instrument Fairies get locked inside of a polar bear's cave in Alaska, the Violin Fairy manages to escape and manages to get out to alert the Little Einsteins and Rocket. When she when she finds them, the team and Rocket go on an adventure through Alaska in order to save the instrument fairies. So, to begin my look at this episode, let's talk about the story. The episode is pretty straightforward with its idea of the team saving someone or something. And it's pretty typical for the series at this point. And it's pretty good for the most part, but and this is where we move into my thoughts on the episode as well as my critiques. The music in this episode is pretty good, and the scenery in this episode also helps an awful lot. And I'm a sucker for winter settings in episodes, as well as the episodes that take place in the Arctic. Plus, the scenery underwater is pretty good, and the art is interesting. But there is something that holds it back a bit, and that is the character choice for this episode. In this episode, Quincy is the main character for most of the episode, and while I do like Quincy as well as Leo, I consider June and Annie to be my top two favorites, with June being my favorite and Annie being second. And while Quincy and Leo are fine, I don't really think both of them work well as the lead character, whether if it's one of them in the lead role or both of them are paired up as a duo. However, Quincy does work a bit better than Leo, but that would depend on the episode itself. However, aside from how I feel about this, I think while I don't think this episode is one of Quincy's worst as in terms of being a lead character, it is a bit questionable if you ask me. And I feel like this role would be a better choice if it was Annie in the lead role, and if Annie and Quincy could be paired up, because it is an interesting character dynamic that not many people consider. And now, as for our new characters who appear for this episode only, the instrument fairies, they are fine for what we were given. But my favorite is without a doubt the violin fairy, as she is another one of the main characters for this episode. And I do have to point this out. As good as the episode is, I will give Quincy credit for trying to make it up a slippery mountain despite all risks, which I will give a lot of credit to him for. So, while some people wouldn't consider this one of the best episodes, I do consider it to be a pretty good way to start off the release, as it was a never-before-seen episode at the time of the release. Overall, as a story, it is okay, but I wouldn't call it fantastic. And while I do like the episode, I think it is a mid-tier episode from Season 2. Overall, Flight of the Instrument Fairies is a good way to start off the release, and I give it a 7 out of 10. Now we have our second episode, The Puppet Princess. A puppet show is being planned and planned to be hosted in Prague in the Czech Republic. But when the puppet theater rolls off without the puppets, the team in Rocket must help them get to Prague before the puppet show starts. And as thanks, the puppets allow June to be in the ask for June to take the puppet princess's place in the show when she isn't there to do it herself. So, now we have our first of 2 June episodes on this release. And for the most part, it's pretty good, except for a few problems. First off, we are introduced to our 3 new characters who only appear in one episode. The puppets. And while they are fine, it's pretty clear that they're just classified as the comedic relief characters. I sometimes have a problem with comedic relief characters in some shows and episodes of some series, but my opinions on them can vary because it depends on the episode, the show, and the characters themselves. And the puppets are not just comedic relief, but are also pretty terrible in this episode, if you ask me. Because seeing as they got themselves stuck in tree sap and walked right into a bakery, I think it's pretty clear that my opinion on them speaks for itself in this episode. However, despite that, I feel like the team should have been a little bit more responsible for their safety, because they were all in front of them and leading the way. And why couldn't they just why couldn't they just have at least one of them walk behind them in order to make sure that they didn't mess up? I feel like if that was the case, I feel like the situation could have been prevented. And one other thing to mention, I definitely think it's weird that the people behind this episode made it a little bit weird of to have 2 scenes specialized for June to move her nose in tune to the music that is used in the episode. I do think that is pretty funny in a way and kind of cool, but I feel like they're a little bit odd in a way. But other than that, one last thing I should mention about this episode is that the performance itself is pretty good for what it is. And so, in conclusion, while I wouldn't consider this episode a top tier, a bad one, I gotta say the comedic relief does help. And considering that June is one of my favorite characters is my favorite out of the team, does help. Overall, while the Puppet Princess might be a very odd episode, I think it's unique enough to where it's not totally bad. With that said, I give this episode a 9.5 out of 10. Now we have the episode that is the reason why I wanted to review this release. So, our next episode is The Glass Slipper Ball. When the team learns that a dancing party is happening at the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria, which also includes the glass slipper, the team must race against the clock to get June there before 12 p.m. After getting through the Austrian Alps and the Danube River, they make it before 12 but can't be let in due to the dress code. So racing against the clock, Rocket makes a ball gown for June in record time so June can go to the party. Once inside, not only does the glass slipper fit June, but Rocket is also crowned a dancer, and the two spend the entire party dancing with one another. As shocking as this is gonna sound, I actually really like this episode. But the reason why I like it is not just because it's a June episode. So I'm just going to go through the episode in order. It starts off like a typical June-centric episode, which is normal, and we get a reintroduction to June's love of dance, which is usually brought up every now and then, but it was previously brought up a while before this episode. We also learn, however, things then take a turn when Rocket reveals that he's a fan of dancing, when in part thanks to June, but never learned how to dance, which I can sympathize because a little known fact about me, I do somewhat dance for fun, but I don't know how to on June's level. However, I will give credit to June for offering to teach Rocket how to dance someday, and that alone is a very sweet moment. However, the episode then picks back up when the party at the Shunbrun Palace is to start at 12 p.m. And for those who are unaware, this episode is basically based on the Cinderella story, but the big difference and the big plot twist in this story is that the time is reversed, where instead of 12 a.m., it's 12 p.m., which I think is pretty clever in a way. Had it been the other way around, I don't think it would have worked the same. And I will point this out. During certain sections of the episode, I will give credit to the team for the music. The Blue Danube Waltz in particular is one of my favorite music pieces, and had it been a different type of music, it wouldn't have worked the same for Annie's song. And it was all, again, very sweet of June to say that she liked the song, which again is another reason why I like this episode so much. Then things slow down when they get to the Austrian Alps, and June starts to teach Rocket how to dance. But then they are thrown into a high-stakes situation when a giant snowball, which is picking up speed, heads straight for the team, which definitely reminds me of a Season 8 Thomas episode, which I will talk about some other time, but we're losing track of things. And I will give credit for June helping and Quincy for helping Rocket to escape the snowball. That was a very near miss indeed. Then things slow down when they reach the Danube River. And again, the music actually helps with the scene, which is something that I give credit for. And while the art in this episode is minimal, that doesn't bother me too much because the main focus of this episode is, again, the music. But then they are thrown into a speed run situation where they need to get to the Shunbrun Palace fast. They manage to get there in time, but in turn, the doors close due to the dress code. And while it is random for Quincy to try to get the doors open by force, which I will admit is pretty funny if you ask me, my question is, why were the doors locked I'm pretty certain there was no locks on the doors in particular. Well, I guess there isn't a particular reason behind that. But when it's revealed that June can't go in unless she has a ball gown, it we are put into a all hope is lost scenario where June is disappointed that she can't go to the ball. But then Rocket decides to help June by speed running the clock in order to get her ball gown made. I honestly think that is a very sweet moment of Rocket in this episode, because throughout this entire episode, June was helping Rocket to learn how to dance, and this is the least that Rocket could do to thank June, which I will give him credit for. And I will add this. June's ball gown actually does look excellent in terms of design, and I give the animation team, as well as the others behind this episode, a lot of credit for making it look this great. However, in my honest opinion, I think this had a lot of potential to be a basis for a redesign of June. But we'll go into that detail another time. And once inside, June ends up trying on the glass slipper, and it was just the right size for her, and it ended up fitting. However, something I must point out is that the animation team actually made a blink and you'll miss it loophole to this mistake, to something that was not mentioned in the episode. There was only one glass slipper, but during the dress transformation scene in this episode, a second one actually appeared, which potentially means that the team probably knew that there was only going to be one and not a second one, which I will admit was pretty smart. And in addition to that, a golden crown was also featured in this episode, which was for Rocket. And while June and Rocket dancing does seem a bit odd, well, odd for Rocket, it was pretty good for June. It was a good enough way to end off this episode. So, yeah, I basically just reviewed this whole episode in detail, and that's how great it is. And balancing out the positives and negatives for a moment, and everything else for that matter, am I one to believe that this is the best episode of the release, the best episode of season 2, and the best episode of the whole series entirely, despite the fact that there are a few things that are a bit confusing? Yes, I actually believe that. I think you can have a best episode of a release, which may not be 100% perfect. I believe you can have an episode that is perfect in every way, which has a few mistakes. And in the case of this episode, this is the best they can do. So, overall, while many people may consider this episode to be overrated, I actually consider this one to be the best of the entire series. And I will at least give a whole lot of credit to all the people who worked on this episode, because they definitely did do some justice for the original story that this episode was based on. And wouldn't you know it, this is also my favorite June episode. I'm actually disappointed that June's ball gown never appeared again after this episode. It would have been a good idea for the basis for a redesign of June's attire. So in conclusion, this is a top tier episode for the series. A very unique episode, which is my favorite in the entire series. The Glass Slipper Ball is without a doubt my favorite episode featuring June, and my favorite of the whole series. With all that said, I give the Glass Slipper Ball a very well-deserved 10 out of 10. And last but not least, we have our final episode, Little Red Rocket Hood. While Rocket and the team are delivering a pot of rocket soup to Rocket's grandmother, Big Jet takes the soup and the team must get it back from him on their way to Grandma Rocket's house. They end up tracking down Big Jet and manage to get the soup back from him, and they end up near Grandma Rocket's house. But when they find out that Big Jet had made his way there before they arrived, they narrowly avoid it. They stop him from getting the soup back, which results in him landing in the mud. As a closing episode, this one is pretty good for what it is, but there are a few things that are wrong with it. First off, I'm going to start off by saying that this is another story which is based on the tale Little Red Riding Hood. And this is the second episode based around that story that I've actually talked about. The first of which was Little Red Binu back when I reviewed Funny Bunny, but when comparing the two, Little Red Binu is actually the more superior one in comparison to Little Red Rocket Hood. So, while this one just misses the mark a little bit. So, let's start off with the obvious. First off, Big Jet just takes the soup from Rocket and the team just because. Considering that he has such a problem with the team just because of what happened back in Hungarian hiccups doesn't really help. Also to mention that in order to trick them, he ends up disguising himself as a train, but it just looks very terrible. Not to mention the fact that in an attempt to get away, he ends up switching them onto another track. On the topic of this, I really think his train disguise is very terrible. And it's one of the worst I've ever seen. However, and the worst thing that he has done in this episode is when the team tracks him down, but he ends up dropping the pot by accident. That was very stupid of him to do, and if the pot of soup hit the ground, then the soup would have been wasted. And lastly, I'm not really sure how Big Jet managed to get to Grandma Rocket's house without the team noticing, because wouldn't they have noticed him trying to make his way there while trying to catch the soup? However, he does get his comeuppance in the end, in a very hilarious way, actually. The team barely prevent him from getting the soup back, and in turn, Big Jet lands in the mud. However, as good as that is, that doesn't make me like the episode, because very weak reasons are a very lame reason to like an episode. And when the story is all And when all the drama is over and done with, Grandma Rocket makes a few minutes of appears for the last few minutes, and then the episode ends, which I think wasn't very good considering that she had potential, but it was never realized and she never appeared again after this episode. So overall, this episode is an odd one to end off the release. And while I don't hate it in the slightest, it was good in some areas, but underwhelming in others. And as I said earlier, if I just wanted to watch an episode that was inspired by Little Red Riding Hood, well, screw it. I just go back to watching Little Red Binu. However, with all that aside, I also wanted to point out that this episode is technically a sequel to the episode Rocket Soup that happens earlier in the season. However, in comparison to that one, which I will look at another time, this one just pales in comparison. However, I will not say that this is a bad episode. It's just a different version. It's just a different version of Little Red Riding Hood, but it's not as good in my opinion. Overall, Little Red Rocket Hood is a very odd episode, and I give it an 8 out of 10. So what are my final thoughts on Flight of the Instrument Fairies? Well, as shocking as this is gonna sound, I think it's a pretty good one. It's not the best release, but it's passable. When I first got this release, I was basically over the moon with the Glass Slipper Ball. But now that I'm older, I look at not just that episode, but the other ones in a completely different way. Which is really saying something, considering that my gushing over the Glass Slipper Ball influenced my love for it. But nowadays, while it isn't that as good as I used to say it was, I still think it's a pretty good release. It's got a very good mix of episodes, and they range from awesome to excellent to good. I understand why these stories were chosen, since they were advertising it as a DVD with stories that were inspired by popular stories from back then. And while that is still the driving force point, that is the selling point behind the DVD, I still consider it a very good release. This release has got 4 very good episodes that are pretty amazing, depending on how you feel about them, and you can't ask for a release that is better than what we got here. And if you're a fan of Little Einsteins, I'd highly recommend this release for all home media collectors. And that's going to do it for this review. Thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more reviews like this and other home media related content. And be sure to check out my other reviews that are in the playlist down below in the description. So, what is the next review going to be? Well, I'm kind of in the mood for another Dora release, and I think it's time we give some focus to two rare releases from 2006. So next time, I'm going to be reviewing the 2006 rarities of Animal Adventures and We're a Team. But next time, I will not be reviewing one of either one alone, because next time I'm going to be reviewing both of them in my very first double review. So stay tuned for that. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.